Welcome to the afternoon session of the Lane County Board of Commissioners meeting for December 8th, 2020. We're going to start out with item 12A on our agenda, which is a discussion on the matter of presenting a draft countywide greenhouse gas inventory. And with us will be Dan Hurley, Public Works Director, and Mark Nystrom, our Lane County Climate Strategist. You're welcome to start. Hopefully they're on today.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
This is Mark. I'm not sure if Dan is on or not. So I'll kick it off. This is Mark Nystrom. I'm the Lane County Climate Strategist. And today we're going to be discussing our first ever countywide greenhouse gas inventory. I'll be turning it over to our contractors here in a moment. I just want to remind you that this is the predecessor to stepping into phase 2 of the February board order, which was creating a countywide carbon mitigation plan. So before we work on where we start to mitigate greenhouse gases, we need to know where they're coming from. And that's what this inventory will do. Presenting today is Claudia Denton and Aaron Tonys from the Good Company. And so I'm going to turn it over, and Aaron's going to take on the position. He'll be sharing his screen, so be on the lookout for that. And Diana, if you can make him able to share his screen, that would be great.
Will do.
Thank you.
All right. Hello, commissioners. Honored to be here with you. Thank you for having us. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So my name is Aaron Tonys. I'm here with my colleague Claudia Denton from Good Company. I'd like to start by thanking her for all her work on this, as well as Mark Nystrom and Rachel Cohen of Lane County for their work on the inventory and supporting data collection. And as Mark said, I'm here to present the results of the first ever Lane County Community Greenhouse Gas Inventory. The presentation today will be about 20 minutes. I'll start with some greenhouse gas inventory 101, mainly talking about the inventory boundaries and what's included. The majority of the presentation will focus in on the results, and I'll describe the results in 3 different groups. First, we'll talk about the sector-based emissions. You can think of these as local sources of emissions. This is the core of the inventory and our emissions closest to home. We'll also talk about sources of consumption-based emissions, emissions generated outside the county to produce goods, fuels, food, fuels, and services consumed by community members. And then we'll also talk about negative emissions, which include carbon storage by Lane County's vast forest lands, as well as voluntary carbon offsets purchased by the community. And then happy to answer any questions you have. So any inventory starts with a protocol. The protocol for this inventory was the Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions, or the GPC. This is a written document that lays out which emission sources are required in the inventory, what data to collect, and how to calculate emissions. The point of the protocol is to tell how to calculate the weight of greenhouse gas emissions from community sources and activities. All greenhouse gases are converted to a common unit, which is metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. It's how I'll be showing you the results. If it's helpful, 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is equal to about 2,500 miles driven in your car. The data we use for the inventory is mostly from local utilities and government agencies. We used a couple sources from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We also use the state of Oregon's emissions inventory to help estimate emissions for sources where county level data isn't available. All emissions were calculated in Good Company's Community Carbon Calculator, and it's set up to hopefully make this accounting easy for the county for future inventories. All right, so getting into it. Inventory boundaries. So the geographic boundary for the inventory is Lane County, Oregon. We collected data for calendar year 2019, and starting with the sector-based emission sources. So again, you can think of these as local emission sources. These are required sources from the protocol. They are wrapped up in various emission sectors. The first is building energy. So this one looks at natural gas and electricity use by the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors within Lane County. We have transportation energy use. This is primarily gasoline and diesel used for various end uses and modes. We have solid waste and wastewater, so emissions from Short Mountain, as well as wastewater treatment in the county. There's a sector called industrial processes and product use. For Lane County, this is mostly about refrigerant loss from stationary and mobile sources. And then we have agriculture, forestry, and land use. This is the most challenging of the sectors in the protocol, mainly because county level data is limited for in the protocol. Livestock is what is included in Lane County's inventory because data was available. So moving on to consumption-based emissions. This group of emissions is different from the sector-based emissions in that it is estimated, and it's estimated from the state of Oregon's consumption-based emissions inventory. So sector-based emissions use county-level activity data that we collected. The consumption-based emissions inventory is scaling down emissions from the state's inventory. For household consumption of goods and food, upstream emissions required to produce the energy and fuels that are reported in the sector-based emissions, and then also air travel. And for the consumption-based emissions, air travel is not just emissions from our airport in Lane County. It goes beyond that to capture emissions for consumption of air travel services, regardless of where the flight took off from and where it's going. And then finally, we have negative emissions. And again, it's for sequestration and purchase carbon offsets. What you're seeing now is the highest level graphic from the inventory report. You can see along the bottom, there's the groups of emissions I just described, as well as specific sectors within each of those groups. And then it's being reported in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. I'm going to go through each of these independently. So we'll start with the sector-based, the local emission sources. Looking at this, you can see that there's an overwhelming source of emissions in Lane County from transportation energy. Represents 66% of the sector-based emissions. I'll show more details on that in a second. It's followed by building energy use at 21%. You'll see in a moment, building energy is largely natural gas use. And then each of the other sectors is 5% or less of the total. For sector-based emissions for calendar year 2019, they equal about 4.3 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or 11.3 metric tons per person. These graphics show on the left the same thing I just showed in a donut graphic. So you have transportation, building, and the rest of the sectors. And then there's a split for just the fossil fuel fraction of local emissions. So fossil fuels from building energy and transportation represent about 87% of the sector-based emissions for Lane County. The non-fossil emissions are process emissions, methane, refrigerants, nitrous oxide from the waste and ag and industrial processes categories. Within fossil fuels, you can see gasoline and diesel, again, overwhelming sources, followed by natural gas, electricity, and then other fuels. The surprise in this inventory for us was the scale of diesel emissions in Lane County. And so with that, I want to note the source of data for transportation fuels for this inventory. Oregon Department of Transportation was kind enough to give us fuel volumes sold within the county for calendar year 2019 for both gasoline and diesel and various blend stocks. This is the first time they've provided that data for community inventories that have been done in Oregon. So big thanks to them for providing that. It's going to allow for, it allowed for accurate accounting in this inventory, and it sets Lane County up for accurate accounting into the future. It's also a great source because it's very close in how we're collecting data and calculating emissions for natural gas and electricity. The downside of that data set is that there's nothing about modes or end uses of those fuels. It was purely volumes of the fuels. So for this graphic, we did a bit of data collection and accounting and some reasonable educated speculation. So we know that gasoline use is predominantly used by passenger vehicles like trucks. And so that's what you see here. For some of these other sources, like on-road transit, we collected data from Lane Transit District. Waterborne, we called around to local marinas to get at fuel volumes. Off-road vehicles is taken from Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's off-road inventory for Lane County. They actually presented a value for this for Lane County in that inventory. And then rail, we're using protocol methodologies to estimate the pass-through traffic of both freight and passenger rail in the county. The part that's harder to know exactly how it's being used is the other freight and commercial vehicles fraction here. This is diesel fuel. And so we don't know exactly how this big wedge is being used in Lane County, but it's reasonable to speculate that a big part of it is being used by on-road freight transportation up and down the I-5 corridor. It could also be that that is likely the largest fraction of this. And then a smaller fraction might be going to additional rail activity happening in the county, interrail activity within the county. Moving on to buildings, here is the split between residential, commercial, and industrial. You can see here again, we're presenting it in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Industrial being the largest sector, followed by residential and then commercial. The blue here is electricity use. The teal is natural gas use, and then the gray is other fuels, fuel oil and propane. As you can see, natural gas is the largest source for buildings in the county, followed by electricity. The reason for this is we are blessed in Lane County to be served by public utilities that are supplied by Bonneville Power Administration, so very low greenhouse gas electricity. This graphic would look very different if we were in another part of the state served by an investor-owned utility. Some of the other sector-based emissions, waste and wastewater. Overwhelmingly, waste is about Short Mountain landfill emissions. There's also compost, which is only about 6,000 tons for the calendar year. And then wastewater treatment, you can see here. Industrial process and product use, again, is overwhelmingly about refrigerant loss by both buildings and vehicles. And then in ag, forestry, and land use, again, livestock was the emission source in this sector we were able to capture with local data. This is being driven predominantly by the 26,000 head of cattle in Lane County. Moving on to consumption-based emissions. So this graphic is showing them relative to the sector-based. You can see we're bringing in production of goods and food and fuel and air travel. We show these two versions following the precedent set by the state of Oregon. So the state of Oregon does both a sector-based inventory and a consumption-based inventory. So we're bringing them together here to show them on one graphic for Lane County. As you can see, many of these categories represent relatively large emission sources for the county. I'll show more details on those in a second. But when we combine them with the sector-based emissions, you can see they're large, and that is why we include them. We include them because they're known to be large. They're not happening here, but they are the result of consumption here. There's also local actions that can be taken to reduce these emissions. And so we provide this as information to help facilitate discussions around reasonable climate action in the county. Details for each of these groups. You can see goods over on the left there. Categories of note within goods include building materials, things like concrete, asphalt, steel. We have home furnishings and supplies as a relatively large category. Vehicles and parts and clothing are all notable categories. Food, you can see, is a mix of meat and dairy, cereals, and produce. The upstream fuel production, so the energy and process emissions required to extract petroleum from the ground, refine it, and then transport it for our use here. Largest category here in line with what we found in the sector-based emissions. So these in the transport fuel production are all the upstream emissions required to produce the gasoline and diesel used here, and also the biofuels used here. And then at the end here, we have air travel. And again, I described those services before. Moving on to the last category, the negative emissions, the large teal bar you see here. As I start on this one, we struggled a bit with how to present this and whether or not to present it because it's such a large teal bar. And what it represents is the annual, the 2019 carbon sequestration benefit of Lane County's vast forest lands. And so I want to start this one by saying, this doesn't in any way negate our emission sources, right? We're still going to need to reduce those. So it's in no way a get out of jail free card of any of those emission sources, but we wanted to show it because it's such a large benefit, and hopefully it illustrates the important need to maintain and enhance those valuable resources here in our county. So digging into this one again, this is for information only. We knew folks would be interested in the scale of this and so wanted to include it. The protocol is very specific about not using this in any net way or subtracting it from a community total. But again, wanted to provide it as information because it's so vast in Oregon. And it's because in Lane County, over 90% of the land is forested. And so for calendar year 2019, we estimated about 3.5 million metric tons of carbon sequestered by this forest land. This estimate comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Lane County Forest Lands Inventory, which takes into account mortality of forests and harvests and over a 10-year period, and still found significant additional storage. In addition to negative emissions, we also looked at Northwest Natural's Smart Energy Program, which allows folks to buy carbon offsets on their bills. And so our community members voluntarily purchased 22,000 metric tons of carbon offsets. So to bring it back to this graphic, to sort of conclude and summarize, we've got our local emission sources, the sector-based over on the left. This again is the core of emissions in the inventory. These are using local data. They're the most accurate set. Within those, we find that gasoline and diesel are the largest sources of emissions, followed by natural gas use in buildings. Moving on to the consumption-based emissions. Again, these are large sources of emissions. They're calculated differently. They're much more of an estimate. But again, we provide them for information purposes as folks in the community are thinking about climate action and how that might happen. We also include these because State of Oregon looks at both sector-based and consumption-based emissions. And then finally, negative emissions. In Lane County, we're blessed with vast forest lands that sequester a lot of carbon. This isn't meant as a get out of jail free card, more as an illustration about that benefit and the importance of maintaining those resources and hopefully enhancing them over time. And so with that, happy to answer any questions y'all might have about the inventory.
Thank you. Any questions from commissioners? Commissioner Bozovic?
So I have a few, so I might have to come back for a second round. But I'll start out just with the inventory. Is there a lot of difference in our by sector inventory compared to other Northwest cities, communities, counties that have BPA provided hydropower? Because I think it seems like there's not a lot of, you see the same thing. Transportation is the dominant source of emissions. Is that a true statement that we really don't vary a lot from community to community?
I think yes, in general. I think the surprise in this inventory was the scale of diesel fuel sold in Lane County, and again, likely because we're on the I-5 corridor. But yes, in general, certainly communities served by BPA all result in relatively low electricity emissions.
Okay, and then I guess, is that then our per capita total emissions, how do they compare to the rest of the Northwest? I know compared to the US, we're well below, because the US is around 16.6 metric tons per capita. Are we right in there with everybody else?
I think that's fair to say. We struggle sometimes with trying to benchmark one community to the next, just because there are differences in both the activity happening there and then also the data that's available to calculate emissions. But yes, in general, you're right in there, I would say, with everybody else.
Yeah, which is more or less what I would expect of an inventory of this community, that would be right in line with just about every other community with the similar population and similar spread between urban and rural that we have. So that kind of gets me to a question I have relative to negative emissions. There's no accounting in this at all for the emissions of wetland methane. It accounts for about 30% of total global emissions of methane is from wetlands. And over the years, we are seeing a consistent loss of wetlands to development and other agriculture and other reasons. Even though that isn't necessarily a good thing, it's still a decrease in methane emissions, and methane's 84 times more potent than CO2. So 1 ton of methane reduction is 84 tons of CO2. And we've seen somewhere between from the estimates, 38% to 58% total loss of wetlands in Oregon since the white man came out here, and we're losing about 500 acres a year in the Willamette Valley. I don't see a bar for loss of wetlands as far as a negative emissions.
That's an interesting point. What I can say is in the protocol, wetlands accounting, like you describe, isn't included right now. I hear what you're saying. I don't know how to respond beyond that, other than it isn't included in the protocol right now, though you're making a case for it to be included. I don't doubt that.
Yeah, I think it should be, because I think we'd be surprised what a large blue bar that would be below the line. As we look at building energy and how much is accounted for in the fact that there's methane escape from our natural gas systems, and that's creating a large footprint there. I think you'd see a huge footprint on the other side. Not that it's necessarily been a good thing that we've lost wetlands, but it has been a balance to this whole discussion that isn't brought in very often.
This is Claudia Denton from Good Company. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Commissioner, I would also like to add that I would like to correct that global warming potential of methane is actually 28 and not 84. It does vary a little bit as new information comes out, but methane is 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide. I just wanted to add that for clarification.
Thank you, Claudia. I think it's just time scales, the only difference there. Commissioner, I think your number's right on a 20-year time span. Claudia is referencing a 100-year time span, but that's probably getting a little geeky for this conversation.
I love geeky.
Likewise.
Did the two of you talk offline? No, I'm just kidding.
Thanks. That's all I have for now.
Any other comments or questions from commissioners? Commissioner Farr. You need your audio.
There we go. Sorry, I have a couple of questions that have been kind of nagging me that may at some point become part of this discussion. The first one is when I fly, when I'm in a plane flying over Oregon, I see huge clear cuts, and these clear cuts are about up to a quarter of a mile wide, and they go from border to border. They're called electricity lines.
Mm-hmm.
How do you take into account the loss of carbon sequestration due to the placement of these huge swaths of land that have been cut clear to provide electricity?
So Commissioner, we didn't look at that specifically as a source, but within the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Inventory, over a 10-year period, they're taking account of mortality of trees as well as harvest of trees for various purposes. I would assume that one would be in there as well. So again, those things are being accounted for, and they still found an additional carbon sequestration. I hear what you're saying, and for specific projects, that might be a great loss, depending on the lines and where they're run. But again, it wasn't split out as a specific sort of subsector in that USDA resource we used for this.
Thanks. And my point is that these huge clear cuts, which really go from border to border, and it's not just one through Lane County, it's lots and lots of these huge clear cuts through Lane County, through our forest lands, up and over lines, over rivers, etc., will never be replanted, ever, ever, until the electricity lines are taken down sometime in the future. So, you know, when we look at timber that's being lost due to clear cutting, you know, I'd love to see the numbers that are produced by the electricity that is produced, that's delivered, not just to Oregonians. You know, BPA's electricity doesn't come to Oregon. You know, these huge swaths of clear cut go all the way to their terminal source, which is in California, or enters the grid at whatever point it enters the grid. So, you know, I would love to get some numbers on that, because, you know, we look at all other numbers and that really is a real one. And we need to kind of balance that into all of the other discussions when we talk about electricity replacing natural gas as a cleaner source of energy. The second question I have is regarding BPA. We have a lower footprint because of our proximity to BPA. What percentage of BPA's energy is generated through hydroelectricity?
Oh, that's a good question, and one I don't have off the top of my head. I can speculate, but that's all I'd be doing right now.
Darn near 100. Yeah. But and that being said, do we at any point take account for what those dams that produce all of this electricity that we're going to replace natural gas with, what those dams have done to our rivers and what they continue to do to our fish travel, fish habitat, etc. You know, it's a lot of things that we don't take into account when we look at one source of direction for the future, one direction for the future. We forget the the impacts of things that are in place that we're hoping that will become replacements for things that we are dependent upon, or we become in one way dependent upon, such as gas. You know, and those are just questions that have been nagging me, and I'll ask those. They may not be 100% put into this conversation, but if you fly over Lane County, you'll see these clear cuts. They aren't a few hundred, there aren't a few acres in nature. They're hundreds of miles long, and they are, I don't know, up to a quarter of a mile wide, and they will never be replanted.
Absolutely, and certainly in agreement with what you're saying. Commissioner, that was our motivation for including this bar, was to highlight the benefit of it, in order to think about how best to maintain it, and hopefully enhance it over time, and make good decisions about that.
Enhancing that bar is something that is very absolutely, but also the lack of ability to enhance that bar is through the clear cuts that will never be replanted. It should be a part of the discussion.
Commissioner Burke? And if you're not speaking, if you could be on mute, we're getting a little feedback from folks.
Thank you. And thank you for this presentation. I don't know how good company arrives at formulas that can quantify this, but I'm delighted that you seem to. So I'm going to start with some simplistic and then get a little more detailed. It seems to me the reason we're trying to identify areas of carbon emission is to form the basis for action. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. It looks to me on the graph that you have up right now, could I fairly say that all of the bars to the left of the local carbon storage bar are human activity related?
Yes.
And the bar to the right is nature?
Yes.
Okay, so hopefully nature will bail us out.
It won't. I don't think it will. I don't think it will. We need to mitigate our human sources of emissions, no doubt.
No, I didn't mean, yes, you're right. But it needs to be weighed in. Let me make a suggestion. And I say this with all respect, but I think that the statement that you and Commissioner Farr made might be incorrect, that the clear cuts under power lines, and thank God they are cut under power lines right now, will never be replanted. Wouldn't you say that in the event communities moved to more decentralized energy production, i.e., solar on rooftops, carports, microgrids, battery storage, etc., residences, commercial buildings, wouldn't you say that if in fact we can become energy independent vis-a-vis distributed energy, that we might be less reliant and we might one day lead to the elimination of those transmission lines? I mean, is that not conceivable?
It is conceivable.
Okay. We're talking about climate action plan, so let's hold that out there as a conceivable thing and something that may impact it. Now, I have a question for you, because depending upon one's, there's this age-old debate that talks about, timber industry being good for the environment and sustainable versus not, depending upon your political persuasion. And depending upon the science that you read, you made a statement that said mortality of trees versus harvest of trees as some sort of formula to compute greenhouse gas emission. Could you elaborate on that at all?
Yeah, so in the USDA forest inventory for Oregon, they look at a great many things, certainly spatial distribution of trees and species, and they're looking at ultimately how much biomass is contained in that. So they're looking at the types of trees, an annual growth rate of those trees, and to net out that growth, they're also looking at the number of trees that are dying and the harvest that's taking place within that same area.
Oh, so you could literally, and we won't do it now, but you could dissect each of these bars so that before we commit to action, we have a greater understanding about all of the implications of each.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's lots of detail in all of these. No doubt about that. We have to roll it up somehow and be able to compare and contrast various things. But yes, there's a wealth of detail in that particular study.
2 more points, Chair, and thank you for the time. What % of the energy used in Lane County, given the structure of public utilities, BPA relationship, and let's assume that hydro electricity is clean. What % of electricity in Lane County is from dirty sources?
So that's a challenging question. We have a number of utility. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
That's okay. Can't we just look at, couldn't one just look at the energy portfolio of each utility in Lane County?
Absolutely. I just don't have it in my head right now.
I would request the next time we look at this that you provide that. I think that would be interesting.
So you're looking for, just to confirm, so you're looking for, I don't know, a pie graphic showing the generation sources in aggregate for all the utilities that serve Lane County, a pie graph that shows where the supply is coming from?
Yes, if I may, and then I'll turn my 2 into I'll leave it at this. I'm taking too much time. In my perfect world, for data upon which to base certain decisions, a pie graph for each utility in Lane County, and then aggregate it. And because it would seem to me that that's really one of the starting points for getting to a net zero Lane County in such a way that it doesn't disrupt business as usual.
Yeah, so Commissioner Burney, I do have this to offer for right now. And it's not getting at the specific generation sources for each utility. But what this graphic is showing is the blue bars is electricity use in megawatt hours by the utilities that serve the county. So obviously EWEB is the largest provider in Lane County and so on. And then the orange dot in each of them shows the greenhouse gas emissions per megawatt hour. So the intensity per unit of electricity for each of the different utilities. I don't know if this is all helpful or not, and it's not just what you asked for, but it is what I have available.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. This has been very useful and informational, and I'll yield my time so that Commissioner Burney and Commissioner Buck and Commissioner Bozovich and Commissioner Farr can ask more questions.
Any other comments or questions? I have one that kind of parlays off a previous question. In the negative emissions category, that negative bar was explained to be trees.
It is trees, it's forest, yes.
Is there any other production or any other source of carbon sequestration? And part of it is because my question about solar. So if solar could be installed and use the energy, at least produce enough energy as it takes, could it ever result in negative emissions or something other than solar, could it also be used for negative emissions? Is there anything else other than trees?
I mean, so solar, I think the best we could hope for solar is net zero, because certainly there's energy and emissions required to produce the solar panels. And eventually they will pay off. They will pay off that carbon debt, but it is there. The other sources of negative emissions certainly could be grasslands. They could be soil carbon sequestration. I know the ag industry is very interested in a phrase called carbon farming right now, and regenerative agriculture to build more carbon in the soil. And then there's technology negative emissions. So carbon capture and storage, where you're taking a pipe and you're sending those emissions underground for storage. There's also direct air capture, where you're literally trying to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. All those, the technologies are still emerging. The best we have for carbon storage right now is the biological options.
So if I asked that because I was looking at this graph, which begs the question, what could we do? Could we get more negative emissions? Can we, of course, as we're talking about, mainly reduce positive emissions? And, you know, if we're going to solely focus on one or the other, or are we, as the climate committee continues to work on that, find action items for both?
Certainly, I would say finding action items for both is in everyone's best interest. I think the priority undoubtedly has to be on reducing sources of sector-based emissions. First and foremost, and I don't know, the first 10 priorities has to be that. There also certainly can be enhancements of biological sequestration. But this graphic is unique to Lane County, Oregon. You know, not every geographic location in the state or in the country has a graphic that looks like this, right? We're blessed to be surrounded by these enormous trees. And so we are a geographic anomaly for this graphic. So certainly there are things that could be done, enhancing soil carbon, maybe using food waste to compost to enhance soil carbon. And there's other opportunities here within our forest lands as well. But there's no doubt we have to mitigate sources of our sector-based emissions in order to meet the climate goals that'll keep us away from the worst of climate change.
And Chair Buck, this is Mark Nystrom, climate strategist. We'll be coming back to you in the coming months with a rollout of our strategy going forward, letting you know how we're going to address that phase 2 of how do we mitigate carbon. And I'm sure that there will be conversations around sequestration included. But that's next on the to-do list.
Very good. And my last question, and maybe this is also for the next report, is just a brief update on how the Climate Action Committee is coming along.
Sure, this is Mark again. We have had 2 meetings, and as you can imagine, starting out one of these committees, there's a lot of bureaucracy and setting up rules and regulations and how we're going to behave. So it's been pretty wonky the first couple of meetings, much to the distress of some of the members. Want to get in there and get their hands dirty and start coming up with ideas. We have a subcommittee that's working on working agreements. We're going to meet briefly at the end of December to approve those. In January, we're going to meet and establish who our chair and vice chair is. The bylaws state that happens at the first meeting of the year. So we decided to wait till that first meeting, and we'll be working on a work plan. So it's kind of that, you know, a lot of committees that we join have been up and running for years. This has been a learning what we didn't know kind of process, but really excited about the people who are involved in the organization or the committee. They're a fantastic wealth of knowledge, a broad spectrum of folks from across multiple different sectors. And so far, everyone's been just very polite and very professional with one another. And despite the fact that we're probably going to have some conflicting views, I think that we're all going to be able to work together really well.
Great, that's good to hear. Any other final comments or questions for this discussion? I don't see any, so thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you all. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
We're gonna move back to our agenda. And before we move on to commissioners' business, I wanted to take a moment to go back to county administration announcements. Mr. Mokrajewski was able to get through a couple of items, but we didn't have time for questions or anything further. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Mokrajewski.
And I don't have any other updates other than if commissioners have questions on the items we provided updates for you on.
Any questions? Some of you freeze on me, so I'm not entirely sure if a hand goes up sometimes. I don't see any. Okay, and we did skip because we didn't have county council in this morning. If council is here, if there were any announcements or updates.
No announcements, Chair Buck.
Okay, then we'll go on to commissioners' business. Any announcements from commissioners? Commissioner Sorensen.
I think I jumped the gun on the future board announcements. Sorry.
Commissioner Burney.
If you recall, I had mentioned earlier that Commissioner Bozovich had come up with what I thought was a great idea. Excuse my voice, I have a frog. and that was to establish the right kind of fiscal agent for a fund that might offset some of the initial costs for those wanting to rebuild after the Holiday Farm fire, because they're going through an arduous enough process as it is. And I just wanted to share that Mr. Mokrajewski and I made that presentation and pitch to United Way. I was glad that the commissioner was gone, so I got to do it with our county administrator. And we learned late last week that, Mr. Mokrajewski, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we learned late last week that United Way unanimously agreed to provide that service, which means that at a minimum, Commissioner Bozovic and I are going to have to get into gear and start doing our best to raise funds, and we hope everyone will join in for a fund that United Way will manage and deploy specifically for victims of the fire that are rebuilding. Commissioner Bozovic, Mr. Mokrajewski, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say to Commissioner Burney, as the board knows, I serve on the United Way board. As a member of the board, I did recuse myself from voting on this matter when the United Way board took it up, just out of an abundance of caution, out of any perception of conflict, because I and Commissioner Burney presented to the executive committee several weeks ago after it was brought to the board for discussion. And then last week at the United Way board, they also had some follow-up questions, and we responded to very detailed questions about how this fund would work and sort of who is going to be responsible for what. So we responded with all that information. The United Way board was unanimous and really enthusiastic in their desire to partner and support with the county on this effort. And I think they feel like it's a way for United Way to use its capacity and skill and what it's known for in the community for raising resources for a good cause. There's some details we have to work out, so we're going to work on an MOU between the county and United Way on what that will look like. And then, what we expressed is that it really will be on county officials to do the raising of resources for covering expenses for individuals who are financially distressed and desire to rebuild as a result of the Holiday Farm fire. That financial barriers, that financial challenges won't be a barrier to rebuilding and helping people rebuild as quickly as possible, understanding that has a big impact on families' lives, mental health, and communities. So really pleased about that. And thank you to Commissioner Bozievich and Bernie for leading that charge. And we'll certainly update the board with more information as we move forward. So Commissioner Bozievich, you certainly can say anything if you'd like.
I'll just say I'm looking forward to getting the MOU and all the I's dotted and T's crossed so that I can start going out in the community and raising funds. This will be a little bit different than some of the other fundraising we've seen for fire victims. The initial relief efforts just to do things like replace clothes, buy gas, and replace various household items, et cetera, support food, for them. All that stuff's kind of, getting to the point where it's pretty much matured. This is specifically about helping people that are under, financial constraints overcome some of the hurdles to rebuilding. I don't know if we'll be able to raise enough to rebuild in, the entire community. That's just such a big lift. But just if we can do some things like help folks pay their permit fees, help them pay some of their engineering costs or their design costs, that's the initial barrier for them going and might not have been covered under their insurance or, particularly those that are low income and replacing maybe some of the structures that we would, weren't on the high end of what was destroyed in the fire, and get those folks back in the community as quickly as possible. I'm just really looking forward to doing the hard work once we get all the stuff settled in the MOU done of getting that funded. And I really look forward to jumping out there and doing that, because it's kind of like this is getting the bricks and mortar back on the ground and people back in homes. And I'm just happy that Commissioner Bernie was willing to partner with me about that. We kind of had fun partnering together on the courthouse work, and I just went to him again and said, "What do you think?" And he was like, "I'm in for it." So this should be a great effort of the two of us again trying to raise funds and get something done and help out the victims up there, particularly those in financial distress.
So if I may, I'd just like to add that actually my response to Commissioner Bozievich was, "That's such a good idea. I wish I thought of it." And Mr. Mokri-Heise, you have expertly navigated this. I did not anticipate after our presentation, given the encumbrance that United Way is already undergoing with so many initiatives. So thank you very much for that. And I have to say that, I got to bring this topic up to the board, but really it was Commissioner Bozievich, Steve, and Commissioner Buck. I spoke at length with her because most of the people that we're hoping to help really are her constituents. And she kind of guided me prior to and after the United Way presentation also. So I thank you all, and it's a delight to share this. And honestly, Jay and I are 0 for 1. I'm kind of looking forward to to doing this again with all of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's great news. I really want to sincerely appreciate United Way for being willing to take up this effort. I look forward to partnering with my fellow commissioners on helping raise money for rebuilding. up the McKenzie River. It's so important, especially for those that are low income and don't otherwise have the means to rebuild, or were renters, or were uninsured. I know so many people that were up there that were uninsured, and it's quite typical for folks that are out in rural areas to not necessarily always carry insurance. And when a catastrophic event like this occurs, there's zero recourse available to them. So thank you all very much, and hopefully we all together can raise some funds to help everybody out. And United Way already has another wildfire fund that they're being great stewards of, and appreciate their efforts on that part as well. Recovery will take years, but the best we can do is get an early jump start on funding and recovery and policy changes that make that happen, and it will only increase chances for people up there to be able to rebuild faster and stronger. Are there any other announcements? Commissioner Sorensen? Sorry, I thought I saw your hand up. All right, no other announcements. We'll go to future board assignment requests. There's Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. I have two as a follow-up to the public comment. The first was on the polystyrene to direct legal counsel to draft an ordinance and then forward it to the board for the board's consideration. And if the board wants to have a work session or not, then that will be subsequent to the drafting. The idea I have is that the legal counsel will take the Florence and Eugene ordinances and convert them into a county ordinance applying across the board. So that's my first one.
All right, I'm looking to other commissioners. Commissioner Burney, we need 3 head nods if this is to go forward.
I wasn't going to nod yet. I was just going to say that personally, I have no strong feelings about whether a draft ordinance is developed or not. That would be fine. But I do think we ought to have a work session so that, and maybe that draft ordinance could ground it, but a work session on this, because that was what was requested. And I would nod my head to that.
Great. I think we have 2 different items actually looking for head nods. One is actually drafting up an ordinance right away. One's doing a work session. And I need to know if there's enough head nods for either one of those or both.
Well, I'm in favor of both, but the reason I suggested we get the ordinance first is it will be a more focused work session if the board wanted to have the work session. But I do agree with Commissioner Burney that what was requested was to have a work session. And I'm in favor of both.
Okay, let's start with the work session then. And I'm fine with the work session. I just want to note that if we pick out one item, there's lots of other bad stuff that's in our environment and in our landfill. And I'm not sure if this is something that we want our Climate Action Committee to be working on. I don't know if it's part of their jurisdiction or not, really, or part of their goal to discuss these things. Commissioner Burney.
I think I mentioned that when I first got this request, I referred them to the Climate Action Group, the Climate Advisory Council. And my sense from the discussions and subsequent emails I saw was that they requested action quicker than that group could provide. I don't know which the right place is, but I've gone through that exercise with the petitioners.
Okay. Do other commissioners have thoughts on this? I don't see anything. So I'm okay. We got at least three that are interested in a work session. I'm going to be interested in talking about more than just polystyrene because of what I just mentioned. There's product stewardship issues all over the place. So who would you like to invite to the work session, which is, I know what Mr. Mokrajewski is just about to ask when he follows up with us.
Well, my question really is what would you like? Certainly we can schedule a work session and the board can discuss the issue. The question is if you want information from staff, any type of analysis or information provided to you by staff, that we would need clarity on. If you want to just have a work session where the board discusses it and without input from staff, then that's certainly easy to do. If you want a work product from staff, then we would need clarity on that.
I will also add that as a reminder, we have 15 items remaining. We may have 1 or 2 less by the year's over that are in front of this item, depending on what the next agenda team does. So it might be worth begging the question as to when the Climate Action Committee might get along to this item, if it's before the board could get to it. Just putting that out there. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. And as I mentioned earlier in this meeting, I'm interested in a discussion regarding polystyrene and limiting its use. I think at this point in time, staff has hands that it seems kind of heaping things on to just shove it on the end of the existing list of things that we have to that we already have on the pending list. So I'm interested in it, and I'm interested in it probably at a later date.
Okay, so I see enough interest that it be put on a board assignment request. It's up to the agenda team to figure out when it might come up as a priority for our board meetings, because we do have so many things. Any other board assignment requests? I see Commissioner Farr and then Commissioner Sorensen.
Let's go ahead and exhaust Pete's first.
Okay, Commissioner Sorensen.
I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Ricker's suggestion. He came in for public comment today. He's worked with county staff, including Jeff Turk and also Jeff Orlandini of Waste Management. And what he wants to do, I believe, is he wanted to have a report back from the county on whether the county could be involved with his free store. He has a proposal to try to keep things from going into the landfill of particularly furniture that's not otherwise acceptable by the various nonprofit groups like St. Vincent de Paul or other groups around town that around the county that accept used items. And he has noticed in his trips to the county's dump that that there's a lot of usable material that's being thrown away, and he wanted to, I think, feed 2 birds with one seed here and have the county assist with some property and also some energy of some sort to promote use of these. One of the contacts he gave me was for a local government in Illinois, which does have this in place. And I called the executive director of the entity out there and said, how does this work? And they said, well, we have a unused room in one of our facilities, and we ask people from the community to drop these items off, and then we invite people, poor people, to look through the items and take them. And it's done very informally, and she said it didn't involve a lot of staff. I guess I'm not to the point of saying we definitely should direct staff to do this, but I am at the point of suggesting that we request a report back from staff on the feasibility of it and whether they think it's worth pursuing further.
Are there any other head nods for this item? I'm not seeing any. Any other board assignment requests? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. And Mr. Mokarajski, this is not actually going to be a request at this point in time. Just a heads up. At lunchtime, I had a meeting with the chairs, what we call the chairs of the Human Services Commission, where we establish agendas for the Human Services Commission. The Human Services Commission, as we all know, is a intergovernmental committee. It's a Lane County committee that is funded by Eugene, Springfield, and Lane County, and thereby is a policy recommendation group to all three bodies. The membership is elected officials or budget committee members. The Poverty and Homelessness Board is a multi-jurisdictional committee, which is not funded by anyone else other than Lane County, but it is other jurisdictions are involved. In addition, the membership of that committee has lived experience people as well as providers, in addition to the elected officials. So we talked at lunchtime, Mr. Mokarajski, about something that I had kind of bludgeoned away this morning at, which was the mess garbage heaps that are surrounding some of our impromptu camps. And we determined that among us at lunchtime that it's a good idea for the Poverty and Homelessness Board to possibly take a first look at that, to see what kind of recommendations we may have, because that board does involve people with lived experience who can provide that kind of information as to why these things occur, why the trash occurs. And maybe the lived experience people are the best ones to suggest a solution for making certain that people are living in better conditions. So while it's not a requesting hand raised for an agenda item, it will be moved forward on agendas regarding the discussion that I had this morning. And one last thing on that, Mr. Mokarajski, you have not passed the buck on anything. In my experience with you, that all of the years that I've worked with you, you don't pass the buck. You accept the buck. The buck stops with you quite often. And I think that my inarticulate meanderings this morning maybe suggested that I thought you were passing the buck to other jurisdictions. You're not. It is really the responsibility of us all as jurisdictions to handle it. Thank you.
Any other future board assignment requests? Last call for today. Okay, I don't see any, so we'll go to review of assignments.
So the one that I saw head nods on was the work session on polystyrene. And I just need some clarity on what you would like. Again, if it's just a work session for the board to talk about the issue, we can schedule that. The agenda team can schedule it. If there's a request for staff to do some analysis, a report, or provide information or a presentation to you on something, we need to know that so that we can assign it.
This came up, what, a year ago or so, maybe a little bit more. And at the time, the state legislature had some legislation that was on the table regarding this, and we all know how that went. So it didn't go anywhere at the state legislative level. I don't know if has any place in the current upcoming long session. But I do remember that Mr. Hurley had some thoughts on this particular item, and Mr. Kyler may also have some potential information on upcoming legislative items. It's still a little bit early before the public has seen what might come on in a long session, but for me, that would be a good start. What do other commissioners think? Anybody? Commissioner Burney?
I only did that for you to break the silence. No, I think that my thought is that makes sense. It makes sense in terms of being informed by what the state would do, which might make this request obsolete. It also, if the state does not take an action and the request is current, I would think just the existing ordinances that municipalities in Lane County have, so that we could look at them. I would think maybe a rationale for the request from the group making the requesting. And to me, that would be, to me, just speaking for myself, that would be enough of a structure to have that work session.
Is that enough for you, Mr. Mokriski?
I think so, and we have a legislative committee meeting later this week, so I think Mr. Kyler can provide that, provide an update on any state legislation. He also sent me a note saying that DEQ has a much more comprehensive proposal. So we probably can get an update from Mr. Kyler, and I think Mr. Hurley can also provide some information, and we'll go with that. It likely, since the agenda is already set for next week, it'll be something in the first quarter of next year.
Well, as the chair mentioned, there's a few other ones dangling out there waiting as well. So I don't know when the timing would be.
I think that would be fairly aggressive to get it in the first quarter of next year, given our priorities. But the agenda team will give it a go. Okay, there's no other assignments. There's no executive session today, so I'll ask our final question of our meeting. Any other business? Okay, I don't see any. That is all for today. We are adjourned.